Inside of our snippet edit form, we want to add in a button underneath our editor. And anytime we click on that button, we want to call the server action we just put together. We've gone over how we call server actions previously, but this time around, life is a little bit different. Because previously, we spoke about calling a server action from a server component. This time, we're talking about calling a server action from a client component. So let me show you a couple diagrams and understand how this is going to work. All right, so again, we're talking about calling a server action from specifically client components. We're going to take a look at two different options for implementing this. In option number one, we're going to set this all up pretty much the exact same way that we did inside of a server component. So we can import some action at the top. We can then create a form down here and give it an action prop, and then we'll assign to that action prop our server action function. The only big difference here this time around is that we are trying to include some information not from a form, so not from like inputs inside that form or select elements and so on. Instead, when we call this action right here, we want to include along with it some state. So the source of our information going into the server action is no longer a form, but some state instead. To implement this, we're going to use a bind function. So I know the syntax right here is a little bit confusing, but we are taking our actions.editSnippet function and we're calling bind on it. And the second argument to that is our code piece of state. If you've never used the bind function before, that is totally fine. The bind function is included with default JavaScript. So this is not something tied to Next or server actions. This is just plain old JavaScript here. If you take a function and you call the bind function on it, any arguments you pass in after the first one kind of preload the function, so to speak. So we get a new version of our edit snippet action function, but whenever we call that one, it's going to already have as the first argument assigned to it, this code argument. In short, if I were to call right here, edit snippet action, that function, when it actually runs, the first argument to it is going to be automatically the code argument, and I don't have to pass it in as a separate argument. So this is how we're going to include some bits of state along with our call to the server action. Whenever we use this approach, our arguments to the server action are going to change a little bit. So the first argument is now going to be that bound argument, in this case, the code that we passed in. And then the additional arguments after that are going to be the form data, same kind of form data it was previously when we made a server action before. In this case, our form data is going to be empty because we are not including any input elements or anything like that inside of our form tag. So this approach is really good anytime we want to somehow access some state or something like that inside of our server action. And if we want to, we can also have some input elements with the form right here, but in this case, we just didn't need it for this particular client component. Okay, so that is option number one. Let's take a look at option number two. In option number two, we are again talking about calling a server action from a client component. With option number two, we're going to treat things like a little bit more traditional or classic React. So we're not going to take advantage of a form element or something like that. We're not going to assign an action prop to it or anything. Instead, we can use this approach to run a server action pretty much at any time that we want, and it doesn't have to be tied to a user submitting a form. We can use this approach to run a server action whenever a user, say, types or clicks the button or drags and drops something around or based upon a timer or anything like that. So anytime you need to call a server action, whenever a user just basically does anything besides submitting a form, you can use option number two. So here's how it would work. We're still going to import our action at the top. We'll then have a button or something similar. And whenever a user clicks on that button, we'll run our event handler. And inside there, we're going to do something with a function called start transition, which I'll explain in just a second. And inside that, we're going to just directly call our server action. And we can easily pass in any arguments we want to pass in. So in this case, we need to communicate code. So we're just going to pass code in directly. That code argument will be taken off to our server action and will be executed with it. Now, with this approach, our server action is not tied to a form at all. So there is no form data or anything like that that are provided as arguments to the server action. Now, you might be kind of curious, what's the deal with this start transition function? Well, inside of our server action, when we run it, as I mentioned several times, in a server action, we're usually going to change some data or create data, and then we are very often going to redirect a user around somewhere else inside of our application. The goal of start transition is to sync up the change in data to our database with that navigation. In short, it really just makes sure that we don't navigate before our data has actually been updated. If start transition was not here, we might navigate to another page before our data has been updated and is ready to be displayed on the screen. So that's the one downside to this approach. We have to add in this start transition thing, and it's kind of confusing. And it's kind of like, hey, why is this here? And it's not going to become evident why you're adding it into your code until you start to navigate around and you notice, hey, wait, you're seeing outdated data all over the place. So that's the goal of these start transition. All right, so now between these two approaches, the very obvious question is, which one should we work? Or which one should we use at all? I think they both have their place. The upside to option one is a huge upside. This is a big benefit. We can use option one to create forms that will work even if the user's browser is not running JavaScript. Now, you might be kind of curious, why would a user not be running JavaScript? Well, it turns out that there are many applications out there that are created for people who might not be able to run JavaScript in their browser, even if they wanted to. There are very big companies, very often governments as well, where they forcibly disable JavaScript in the browser just to reduce surface area for phishing or malicious attacks and whatnot. So in some cases, you might be developing applications for users where they just plain can't run JavaScript inside the browser. So we can use option number one to still allow those people to use a React application even if they aren't running JavaScript. Option number two also has its upsides. The big upside here is that we don't have to mess around with that bind function at all. Just immediately, that's a big upside. Secondly, this is a lot closer to classic React behavior, where we can kind of modify some data on our server without having it be tied to a user submitting a form. So again, they both have their place. Personally, I kind of favor option number two, but you are going to see a lot in the Next.js documentation favoring option number one. And again, it's all because you can use this without running JavaScript inside the browser. So we're going to generally favor option number one inside this course, mostly just because the documentation really presents this as the go-to way. All right, so now we've seen this, let's go through some implementation in just a moment.